cradle of diplomats for Beijing, and a number of their graduates, I think over 300, have gone on to senior level positions, including Minister of Foreign Affairs. So these are my journalism students, and looking very forward to speaking with you tonight, of course, hearing your views, and then having the chance to ask you some questions about the political situation in the United States, in particular, the issue around race relations and reparations, and of course, hearing more about your work at the University of District of Columbia. So maybe in the interest of time, President Mason, why don't I turn it over to you and let you take it away?
Sure. But just to get some context, maybe you could tell me why this issue of race relations is of interest to you and your class.
Sure. So, given that we're entering the new presidential election cycle, this is a class on journalism, so it's journalistic technique, but also helping the students develop news sense, what is an important story, what is likely to become an important story. So looking at the last couple of years, things like Black Lives Matter, the case of postmarks about the case for reparations, HR 40, these all seem to be gaining more prominence. So it seemed like a good issue for them to really sink their teeth into. And of course, it's a great lens for learning more about all aspects of American society.
Okay, good. So you want me to talk for about a half hour or so, and then questions for the rest of the session?
Sure, that's okay with you.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is go back to the early days of America, put the whole issue in some context. Imagine when Europeans first got here, this was a country that they really stumbled on by accident. And it was filled with what they called Indians because they thought it was India. They went about the business of settling this vast land. Over time, they were able to get a foothold and then fought a war over whether the Europeans in Europe or the Europeans in America would end up controlling this land. That was called the American Revolution. The challenge they had after they won that war was how to take advantage of this huge asset that they had just taken control of, which stretched from the Atlantic, and then ultimately when they came up with the idea of manifest destiny, all the way to the Pacific. How could they get the most out of this this large amount of land that they had just occupied? And so their biggest problem was labor. And the Indians who were here, or who they called Indians, were not reliable laborers in the field for a lot of different reasons. And they really had two sources of labor. One was poor white folks, poor white Europeans who had come here for different reasons, some voluntarily. Some were sent here because they were in prison and they sent prisoners here. Some were debtors trying to escape a life that was not good for them on the European continent. And then the other source was poor black people. Now remember, before slavery even started in America, there were black people here who were just poor people like other poor people here. And then they worked as indentured servants, which meant that they gave their labor for a certain amount of time, and in exchange for that, they were able to get food and clothing, and then ultimately, after 7 years of labor, they were set free to follow their own path. But around the end of the 1600s, something happened called the Bacon's Rebellion. And that was when a large group of poor white people and poor black people marched on the rich folks, marched on the leadership of Virginia, and really almost took over the state. And the wealthy folks that ran the state, this is Virginia, were so afraid of the possibilities of poor people coming together to overthrow them, they began this system called slavery. And it really served two purposes. One, it created the illusion for poor white people that they were more like rich white people than they were like poor black people. And then the second thing that it did over a period of time was turn black people into legal animals. They were by law chattel, property to be bought and sold. That process that began back then has a legacy that exists even to today. Now, the thing to understand about the black people who ended up being slaves is that when they came to America, they weren't born slaves. Many of them were educated, many were artisans and artists, they really, over the course of generations, had to be turned into slaves. And you can read books, for example, by Malcolm X, who talks about the slave maker, where they would stop on a Caribbean island and pull two trees together and then tie a slave's ankles to the trees and then let the trees unbolt and rip the slave in half or the man in half while his pregnant wife would watch. Or they cut the baby out of the woman's stomach and smash the head on the rock while the man would watch. Many of the Africans were lost in the Middle Passage, which was the boat journey from Africa to America, which took many, many months. Many were thrown overboard when slavery was illegal, and the captains of the ships didn't want to be caught with the slaves on the ship. In fact, some books say that so many slaves were thrown overboard that the natural feeding patterns of the sharks in the ocean actually changed from what their normal routes were to the patterns to start to follow the slave ships. And so they created this very cruel, really inhumane system called slavery. Slaves were not allowed to read. Their families were broken up and sold, often across many, many miles. They were denied knowledge of their own history. And all of this because it was a very valuable commodity. There was a point in America where the value of the slaves was actually more valuable than all of the money in all of the banks in America. So this was a big business. And really, America in many ways was built on the backs of these black people, especially in the South, where you had things like sugar plantations and tobacco plantations, which required a large amount of labor in order to be successful. And so, this set up this contradiction in America between what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and have unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on the one hand. But on the other hand, Thomas Jefferson himself owned slaves and even had a slave mistress. And there's an entire line of Jeffersons in America today that are not only white Jeffersons, but black Jeffersons. And so this divided the country in two, literally. There was something called the Mason-Dixon line, and to the north of that line, slavery was illegal, and to the south of the line, it was legal. And eventually, the United States fought a war over this, the Civil War. It was one of the bloodiest wars in America's history. The South wanted to split the Union apart and create two countries, one that was a slave-owning country and one that was not. Now, the other thing to understand about slavery, though, is that even though the slaves mostly lived and were legal in the Deep South, it was an industry that fed the entire United States because the biggest export was cotton. And you couldn't have cotton to feed the mills in the North and the trade with Europe unless you had the slaves. And the banks in the North were the ones that financed, generally speaking, the slave trade in the South. So this was a fully integrated industry that really ran the economy of the United States for a very long time. So they fought the war, and as you know, the North won the war. But they weren't quite sure what to do with the slaves when they won the war. President Lincoln had to free them because he needed the numbers to help win the war in the first place. But his solution after the slaves were freed to make sure that America would peacefully transition out of slavery was to ship the slaves to the country of Panama. That didn't prove feasible. And so he started a period in American history called Reconstruction, where there was an effort to try to reintegrate the slaves into society. During that time, there were many elected officials who were black. There were black businesses that were being developed. There were towns between the end of the Civil War and up through the 1900s that were really what they called Black Wall Streets, where these former slaves were able to develop businesses and generate wealth and really find a way to be successful in America. But then, in order to cut a political deal to get elected, the next president, Andrew Johnson, withdrew the troops, the federal troops from the South, and allowed the slaves to fend for themselves in a hostile environment. And so when the troops left, and Andrew Johnson withdrew the troops because he said he wanted to ensure that America would always be a white man's country. And so when the troops pulled out, a group of terrorists called, for example, the Ku Klux Klan, really started to try to make sure that the former slaves were still the labor they needed to run their businesses. And so they passed laws, like vagrancy laws, for example, where they would arrest young black boys, 8, 9, 10 years old, black men just for standing on the corner, and then put them in jail for 8 years, 5 years, and then the jails would lease them out to the plantations where there used to be slaves. And so when you hear about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which freed the slaves, there's an exception in there which bans slavery, but there's an exception to the ban on slavery in America. And it was an exception that was negotiated by the southern states in order to get the amendment passed. And what it says is that, in a nutshell, slavery is banned in America unless you are a convicted felon. And so they rounded up all of these black men and put them in jail and basically turned them back into slaves. And that went on for quite some time. They fed the mine industry, they fed the farming industry, and that developed into a system called Jim Crow, which was legal segregation in the South, basically apartheid. And because of that, black people were not able to really accumulate any wealth. Remember, at the end of the day, this all is about money. It's all about wealth. And the one thing that this system of wealth privilege, which in America is in the top 10% of the wealth population, 90% are white. And then there's white advantage, which means that even if you don't have wealth, you're the first one in line to get a job. And then there's black oppression. It's those three layers of practices in America that basically keep poor people poor and keep black people, especially, lacking in wealth. Now, so Jim Crow, and then the next iteration of that was the war on drugs, where the United States government brought in cocaine, crack cocaine, put it into black neighborhoods, and really destroyed black communities across America in the late 80s, and put people in jail. Maximum sentences for, if it's your third offense, for example, for stealing change out of a parking meter, you could get life in prison. Or if you were caught as a third offense with a bag of marijuana in your car, you could get life in prison. And so all of these systems are still in place today, which brings us to this question of reparations, I guess. And it's an interesting question because in order for reparations to actually happen, several things will have to take place. One, an admission that America owes a debt to the black people that were enslaved and then oppressed, even from the beginning to today. Second, how do you calculate the value of that? And then third, can you put together the votes to actually make it happen? If you look at what's happening now with our president here and his stance on immigration and, saying there's only certain types of immigrants we want, or saying that African countries are shithole countries, pardon my French, or saying he wants to build a wall at Mexico because America is full. What's really happening is that this debate about whether America is a country for white people and everybody else are invited guests or they're invited guests, or whether America really is a land of many lands and people of many people, that debate is being played out as we speak today. And our president hasn't left much room for equivocation, for you either have to be on one side of this conversation or the other, the way he's drawn the lines. And I think it's going to be interesting to see in the 2020 election how America chooses to go forward. I think I'll stop there and get involved in a conversation if it's okay with you.
Great. That was a very informative and insightful overview of American history, President Mason. I think that complements very, very nicely, our students here have watched 12 Years a Slave, the discussions, research on that. So I think hearing it from you as well is very, very valuable. Maybe before we start the Q&A, though, because they were also quite interested about the University of Columbia. Could you take maybe a couple minutes and share what you're doing there, and then we can jump into the Q&A?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So we are the only public university in the nation's capital. We have programs from workforce certification programs all the way up through the PhD. In the district, we have 5 campuses. We have just gotten our new strategic plan approved, and it's called the Equity Imperative. The reason it's called the Equity Imperative because the District of Columbia, which is the nation's capital here in America, is the richest and poorest city in America. We have great wealth on one side, and we have abject poverty on the other. We, as an institution, as the public institution that serves the district, feel an obligation and responsibility to enable those who are not on a pathway to the middle class to find a pathway, and we are that pathway. Our overarching vision is that every student that walks through our doors will reach their highest level of human potential. And we have 3 doors in. One is the workforce door, one is the open admissions door, and one is the selected admissions door. But the way that we are redesigning the university, every door will lead to the next door. And so a student may come in through the workforce door and reach a level of potential to get off of the seamless pathway to a bachelor's degree, say, but then realize that he or she has more potential and get back on as if they never left. Every program that we are developing now will have a seamless pathway from any door all the way to the ultimate end. We are claiming the urban space because we are what's called an urban land grant university. Land grants universities in America are big schools like LSU, which I'm sure you've heard of, or the University of Alabama. Most of the big football schools are land grant schools. But the United States government created land grant universities in order to democratize education. They gave these large tracts of land to the states to build universities so that common people could go to college. We are unique at UDC because we're a land grant, but we have one land grant service area, and that's the city that we call Washington, D.C. And so we've claimed the urban space, knowing that in the next 40 years, 80% of the world will be living in cities, which means there'll be a lot of people in very small spaces trying to figure out a lot of problems. And we are in the middle of trying to figure out those problems before they get there. We have urban gardens all over the district. We have the largest rooftop organic garden on our campus here in the district. And through our work in service learning, our work in the classroom, and our work in the community, we think we're actually going to end up being a model for higher education in the United States over the course of the next 10 years.
Okay, so our students here have some questions for you. One, yeah, you come up, please. Yeah.
President Mason, I'm honored to ask you two questions. What is the biggest challenge you face as you preside over the university?
Biggest challenge?
Yes.
Yes. So, well, we don't have any problems that money couldn't solve. We have a history here. Let me just briefly explain it to you. So in the late 90s, the city of Washington, D.C. was broke, bankrupt. And so the federal government took it over and cut the budget of the city almost in half, including UDC's budget. And since then, though, the district has been able to bring back all of its institutions, the public schools, the public libraries, the public parks. The last one on the list is the University of the District of Columbia. And so we really are in a rebuilding mode right now. We just bought a new building that we're going to turn into a modern classroom facility, and we're renovating the entire campus. We've hired about 50 new faculty in the last 2 years, but it's a process. And my biggest challenge is making sure that every year we get more money to keep the work going.
My second question is, why does UDC have such low graduation rates?
That's a good question. But it depends on, you have to understand how it's counted. So there's a national database called iPads in America, right? And it measures graduation rates in two ways. For associate degrees, it's who starts in year one, and of that same cohort, who graduates 3 years later. For bachelor's degrees, it's who starts in year one, and of that same cohort, who graduates 6 years later, right? And so our open enrollment door, which is the associate's program, has about a 7% graduation rate, which is not great, but it's not that bad for associate's degree programs. Our bachelor's degree programs has about a 44% graduation rate, which is not that great, but not that bad for bachelor's programs. But the national database puts the two together and blends it. And that's how we end up with 17%. The other thing for us is this. You know, we don't measure our value by U.S. News and World Report because we're not that kind of school. We're not wealthy. We don't cater to wealthy students. Half our students come to us on a part-time basis, which means that they work and go to school. And so they don't all graduate at 6 years or 3 years. But at the end of the day, we graduate more students every year than actually start school here in that year. And so, you know, don't look at that number and think it defines the institution. Thank you. Great question. Let's see your homework.
So I have one question. What factors, in your opinion, can be defined as major barriers for African American students achieving their highest level of human potential?
Major barriers?
Major barriers.
Yes. Yes. So, remember those 3 American practices I mentioned to you? Wealth privilege, white advantage, and black oppression. Those are real barriers. For example, if you're in the top 10% of the population in America, that means you live in the best neighborhoods. It means that you go to the best schools. It means that, did you see the recent admission scandal in America where those actresses were paying somebody to take the standardized test for their daughters? Did you see that?
Yes.
You see it, okay. I wrote an article. I'd be happy to send it to your professor there, saying what the real scandal is. See, because that top 10%, you can't earn your way into that. You have to be born into that, right? And so, you know, you have all the best schools, all the best tutors. You can also make big donations to the university, put your name on a building, right? And at the end of the day, that all guarantees that you're going to go to some of the best schools, which means that you end up with the best jobs, which means that you end up in the best neighborhood. So it's a circular process, right? But my point is this. My point is that because in that top 10%, it's 90% white, and America is only 58% white, right? That means that about 30% of those people at the top are not there because they're talented. They're just there because they were born there, which means that we don't have a merit-based education system. And assuming that talent is not distributed based on race or class, what it means is that a lot of the talent in the Black community and brown community and poor community in America is not being allowed to rise to the top. I know that was a long answer, but my point is that we're wasting a lot of talent in America because we have a system of education that is not based on merit. All right.
Education system support for female African Americans.
I didn't catch the first part.
Is the educational situation worse for female African Americans?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by worse. Generally speaking, Black people in America have many challenges, right? Because of the 3 practices I just mentioned to you. But if you look at who makes up most of the honors students, for example, in public schools, it's African American women. If you look at the enrollment levels in college, it's usually 60% African American women or 70% African American women, and then 30% men. Now, part of the problem is that, you know, a lot of the men are being chewed up by those 3 practices. You know, many go to jail, many don't have jobs, many are absent from the household, and so in some ways, the women, in some ways, Black women are what's left to be able to participate in the educational process. So does that answer your question?
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Well, the next question is, what is your opinion about the future of Chinese students in the U.S. society?
You know, that's interesting. I've been to China maybe 4 times. And at a former school I was president of, we had many exchange programs between universities in China and my former school, Jackson State University. And so I have a lot of, I would say, admiration and respect for the things that I see going on in China, especially from an educational point of view. The other interesting thing is that, as you know, even though in America standardized tests correlate to wealth and whiteness, for some reason, Asians, Chinese seem to do much better on those tests even than many of the white folks. And so how that plays out, you know, in court and in university admissions processes, I don't know. In fact, there's some court cases now that are trying to determine whether, based on those tests, too many Asians are being excluded from American schools because of the people that are born in a position to go to those schools as opposed to earning their way there. And so I would say, you know, the real question is what the question I put to you before, which is the question Donald Trump has put on the table: is America a country for Europeans and the rest of us are invited guests, or is it a country where we're all the same and created equal, and you know, we'll build a new world in a new place called America? Answer your question?
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, during the Trump administration, which education policy do you think is most beneficial, and which one is the most unreasonable?
Okay, say that again.
During Trump administration, which education policy do you think is most beneficial, and which one is the most unreasonable?
Oh boy, there's a lot to that question. Let me say this though. This conversation started about reparations, right? And so in America, we have these institutions called historically black colleges and universities. And these were founded during the time after slavery, but during segregation, when black people in America were not allowed to go to school in America, to white schools. But these institutions, which are really just institutional reflections of black people because they don't have a lot of wealth either, but they do a really great job of producing African-American talent. Half of the engineers in America who are black come from these schools, half of the pharmacists, most of the doctors. And so if I was going to create a policy in education tied to reparations, I would invest money into these historically black colleges and universities and enable them to start to educate more and more generations of black people who have been excluded from a fair process over the years. Some of the other things that are going on in this country, like you know, vouchers, where people can pick any school they want, the destruction of the public teachers systems in America. You know, I have some real challenges with the way those are being done, because at the end of the day, the real question is, do they serve those 3 practices of wealth privilege, white advantage, and black oppression? And if you look at the cycle that keeps repeating itself, which ends up being this, what they call achievement gap in America, which is really an opportunity gap. But as long as that opportunity gap is there, then I'm not sure that any particular policy is going to solve the problem.
Thank you.
Okay.
So my question is, there is a kind of idea, like paying more attention to African Americans is a kind of new discrimination towards other people. So what's your view on it?
That more attention to African Americans is another kind of discrimination? Well, so here's the thing. Discrimination in and of itself is not a positive or negative word, right? You know, if you walk into a situation and see something that is going to hurt you and you walk away, people will say you have discriminating judgment, right? Or if you see something that's good or bad and you decide to take the thing that's good, people will say you have discriminating taste, right? And so the real question is not the word, the question is the intention. Think about this. In America, 77% of the wealth is controlled by 22% of the population. And in that 77%, 88% are white, European descent, right? Which means that 90% of the population has to share 22% of the wealth. And so the question is, how do you start to address that problem? Think about this. One of the ways that the wealth got concentrated in that white 10% is that white men in America have had something called affirmative action from the beginning. They've always had preference for jobs. They've always had preference for loans. They've always had preference for housing. You follow me? And so if it worked to generate wealth for that segment of the population, why, when you try to do the same thing for African Americans, people call it reverse discrimination? It's just applying a long-standing policy in America to a different part of the population. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Kind of, okay. You can ask follow-up questions if you like. I'd like, go ahead. I'm sorry. At some point, I'd like to know what you guys are thinking about all of this. Go ahead.
Hi, Professor Nathan. I have a question for you. Could you give us a general comment on the U.S. policy on improving the treatment of the African American, and which policy do you support most?
Which policy do I what?
Do you support most?
So understand this. There's official policy, and then there's rules, regulations, processes, procedures, traditions, and values that all end up resulting in certain outcomes, right? And so, for example, in America, well, no, let me not go there. On paper, America's policies should not end up with the outcomes that you see here, right? But when the perception on the part of some people is that the real outcome is that America has to stay a bastion of European power, or a descendant of Europe as opposed to a new country for everybody, then no matter what the policies say, you'll find a way to end up and get that done. For example, like I said about slavery, right? On paper, slavery ended in the United States in 1863. But in fact, the treatment of black people, almost as if they were slaves, continued for quite some time after that, right? And so if you ask me what policies I'm in favor of, I believe in the idea of America that all people are created equal, and that we all have unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what I'd like to see are policies that, in practice, make those ideals a reality. Does that make sense?
Well, thank you.
All right.
So next is Yaki.
Hi, President. As we know, many presidential candidates were mentioned preparation during the campaign. Do you think they really mean it, or just use it as a mass weapon to help them with that?
Say it again, please. Didn't catch all of that.
Many presidential candidates would mention preparation in their campaign. Do you think they really mean it, or just use it as a mass weapon to help them to win black people's support?
I see. You know, I've watched many campaign speeches over the years, and it's really hard to tell who really means what when they campaign. Most of the promises that are made during a campaign end up being unrealistic when after they get elected, right? It's kind of like Trump's wall, you know? He's bound and determined to build that wall because he promised it, but look how hard it is for him to actually get it done. And so I do think that there are people who believe that we should fight to make a more just America. And I also believe that as long as America is characterized by those three practices I mentioned, we will not be a just America. And so, sure, there's some level of truth and belief in the people that are talking about reparations. But I think they also are smart enough politicians to know that saying it is one thing, and actually being able to make it happen is an entirely different thing. Okay. Is anybody going to give me some insight into how you all over there see what's happening?
Yes, but she's the last prepared question we have. Then maybe you can ask us some questions if you like.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, good.
My question is, will reparation policy for African Americans cause backlash from other groups like Asians or Jews?
Fair question. Fair question, and it's a complicated world, right? Look at what happened with the Jewish people after the Holocaust. Britain basically gave them a country in order to ensure that what happened to them would not happen again. You know, there's already a backlash in America from poor white people because they do not understand the forces that are making their lives harder, and they blame it on the easiest scapegoat, which in America is non-white people, Asians, brown people, and black people. Now, whether reparations, whatever that means, will cause Jewish people and Asians to resent black people, I really don't know. But I do know this, that there is work that needs to be done to reclaim the lost talent and lost potential of black people in America. And if we are able to do that, that is in everybody's interest. It's not only in the interest of Asians and Jewish people and poor white people, but it's in the interest of America as a whole. and I think ultimately the world. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you, President Mason. So what questions would you have for our students here, or what comments or observations?
Well, first, let me thank you and your students for this opportunity. I always enjoy a chance to interact with young people. And I do appreciate the prepared questions. I'm just wondering if anybody would like to give me a sort of candid perspective on how they see what's happening in America today. There's a lot going on, but I'm sure somebody has something to say about something, and I'm just curious how they see it.
Okay, who would like to come up and share some of their views? So they tend to be a little shy first. Let me maybe I'll call on somebody maybe to get started, or I'll give you one last chance. Then we'll come up and share their perspective.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question.
Okay.
And who wants to say whether or not they think reparations to Black people make sense?
Well, actually, before we answer that, let me get a Shirley. Why don't you come up, because you're going to the U.S. soon, right? Come up, please. Where's up?
Good morning, Professor Mason. My name is Shirley.
Shirley?
And nice to meet you. Yeah. So I will be coming to DC next year for graduate studies. So we've been talking about U.S. Political situations for a while, because this is China Foreign Affairs University, so we've been talking a lot about it. But basically, it focuses on economic situations more. But this semester, we focus on the cultural and also the race situations in the United States. So it's kind of a very original point of view for us. So actually, we haven't done much research on this topic before, the few years past. So probably we would like to, hear more and read more, and also to learn more about this topic from an American perspective.
Very good. What about the tariff situation? You said you studied the economics of it. How do you read what's going on between America and China on the tariff question?
You mean the trade war?
The trade war, yes.
The tariff situation. I think the situation has been eased for a while, especially with the frequent conversations between the high-level talks of the two sides. Liu He went to DC, I think, last week, and they had a very successful talk. So I do believe tariff situations will be improved. And from my perspective, personally, I think tariffs will not help anybody. So we do believe trade war is definitely not a solution, but it's just a manifestation of the problems and the trade deficit, such kind of problems between the two sides. And there definitely will be a solution, probably by talk, probably by negotiation between the two sides. But the tariff is not going to save anything. So that is my perspective.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
Where do you see China-U.S. relations 10 years from now?
Well, that's a really big question. Well, from my perspective, I think China and the U.S. U.S. is what we call one of the most powerful countries in the world, definitely. So it is actually constructing a kind of structure of the world, a world order. And I think what China is doing as the biggest developed nation, and also the recent rising nation, I think China is definitely wants to take control of the situation from now. So you can see from the construction, the proposal of the initiative of One Belt One Road initiative, you could see China is also constructing its own structure for the roads. So I think China and U.S. in 10 years, China is going to grow powerful, more and more powerful, and the United States is definitely going to cooperate in China more intensively and also with a more comprehensive, on a more comprehensive level. So I think the two nations will together grow stronger, and also they will strengthen their communications with each other, because in this way we can create a win-win situation, right?
Very good answer. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Very diplomatic answer. Let me know, maybe we want to come up and share with your view. So she is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Maybe can also help address that question.
Well, I think China and U.S. are stepping into the era of strategic competition now. So actually, your question for the future 10 years Sino-U.S. relations, I'm not very positive. I think we are facing more uncertainties. Especially, you can also see the some calculations from the WTO. They think that Sino-U.S. relationship has influenced also the trend of development worldwide. So I think the uncertainties and the challenges will still happen in the following 10 years. But also China will become stronger in solving those frictions or conflicts between these two countries. So I think it will be fine for us to face those challenges. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
If anyone else wants to share their perspective, I know some of you guys have also been to the U.S. and have some views on this. Does anyone else want to share their thoughts? No? Okay.
Very impressive class.
Thank you. No, this is
I see why
again,
I see why they're going to be future diplomats.
Yes, they are well prepared. So, President Mason, any closing remarks you'd like to share with us?
Only that, it really is about relationships among human beings. And, there are forces in this world that, for their own purposes will find ways to divide us as people. But my hope for the future is that the young folks coming up, no matter where they live or what side of the ocean they're on, will understand that we have more in common than we have differences. And the differences have nothing to do with what you look like or where you live, or what sort of system you live under. The differences are little things, but the big things are things that we all share in common. So I'm hopeful for the future, and maybe I'll see some of you young folks down the line.
Great.
Thank you very much, Professor Mark.
One last thing, President Mason, because I know you mentioned and Dean Moe mentioned that you'd like some video of this. So, Francis Johnson, can you please come here so President Mason can see you? So, these two young gentlemen here are students at the Beijing Film Academy, which is the top film school, actually one of the top film schools in the world. But they very graciously volunteered their time to take some photos and videos. And this one here is my son. So, his name's Francis.
So that's great. We have a television station and a YouTube channel. And so whatever we put together will be seen around the country. I guess, really. Okay?
Occasionally, so we have family there, so so sometimes you can, if Francis is there, you can say hello in person to days.
That'd be great. Tell your dad to bring him around. Okay.
Great. So, President, thank
thank you so much. I know you're a very busy man. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and your perspective with us.
Thank you for the opportunity. See you later.